Hi, this is Catherine from Literacy Volunteers, and this is our Civics Questions video, Session 10, the 1900s. We're going to look at a bunch of events that happened during the 1900s. We'll start back here in 1917 to 1918 and talk about World War I and President Wilson. We'll talk about the Great Depression that runs from 1929 to early 1940s, late 1930s, and the president during that time, Franklin Roosevelt. We'll talk about World War II, a general from World War II who later became president. We'll talk about the Cold War that ran during this period from after World War II all the way up until 1990. We'll talk about the Civil Rights Movement that ran from also after World War II through the 1960s. And we'll look at one event that's not in the 1900s, that was the terrorist attack in 2001. So let's go ahead and get started. World War I was from 1914 to 1918. It involved countries from all over the world. They were basically on two teams. One team was called the Central Powers. They're pictured here in orange. And the other team was called the Allied Powers, and they're pictured in green. The United States joined the war in 1917, and we joined on the same side as the green countries, on the Allied Powers, so that we were on the same side as Great Britain, also known as England, and France, and the Russian Empire, and some other countries. Who was president during World War I? President Woodrow Wilson was president of the United States during World War I. Who was president during World War I? Wilson. You can say Woodrow Wilson, or you can just say Wilson. The Great Depression started in 1929 and lasted until the late 1930s. Some people say it lasted until World War II, further into the 1940s. The Great Depression was a time period when the American economy was very bad. Tons of people lost their jobs. A lot of people couldn't afford food. Many people had to move out of their homes. It was a very difficult time for millions and millions and millions of Americans. People were still struggling with the effects of the Great Depression when World War II started. First, it started in Europe in 1939, but the United States joined World War II when the Japanese government attacked a military base in America on one of the islands of Hawaii at a base called Pearl Harbor. It was a surprise attack, and they sank tons of U.S. Navy ships. As a result of that, the United States joined World War II. Who was president during the Great Depression and World War II? The president was named Franklin Roosevelt. People often call him FDR. His middle initial is D. So people often call him FDR, but his name is Franklin Roosevelt. He was president from 1933 to 1945. He was elected 4 times. Today, a president is not allowed to be elected more than 2 times, but this happened before that change was made to our Constitution. So he was elected in 1932, so he began serving in 1933 when he was officially inaugurated. And then he was elected again in 1936, and in 1940, he decided he should keep running even though he had already served 2 terms, and every prior president had stopped after 2 terms. But in the United States, we still were struggling with the effects of the Great Depression, and World War II had started in Europe. So Roosevelt felt that it was better to have him keep serving as president rather than have a change at that time. So he ran again in 1940, and then for the same reason, we were still at war, he ran again in 1944. He started officially his last term in the winter of 1945, but he died in April of 1945. So he only served a tiny bit of his fourth term. But he served from way back early in the Great Depression all the way through almost the end of World War II. Who was president during the Great Depression and World War II? Roosevelt. We have a few more questions about World War II. As I said, the United States joined World War II in 1941, and we fought until 1945 when the war ended. There were, again, basically two major teams. One was called the Allied Powers, the United States, England, or Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union during most of the war were considered part of the Allied Powers. For part of the war, half of France had been defeated by Germany, so France was not able to really fight as part of the Allied Powers for most of the war. The major Axis powers were Japan, Germany, and Italy. And this is a picture of Adolf Hitler, who was the leader of Germany during World War II. Japan took over a bunch of territory. Japan is here in red, and all of these colorful territories are places that Japan took over at some point leading up to and including World War II. Germany, meanwhile, was originally just this center part, and all of the dark blue Germany had taken over and or was allied with and actually had fully taken over, and then some of the lighter blue are areas that at some points during the war Germany had defeated. More than 60 million people died in World War II, including 6 million who died in the Holocaust. The German government took over 6 million people to live in these camps, these prison camps or labor camps, and killed them in order to kill people from different groups. They killed people who were Jewish, they killed people from other social groups and ethnic groups. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1900s, World War II. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1900s, World War II. Who did the United States fight in World War II? We fought against Japan, Germany, and Italy. Those were the three main countries in the Axis powers that we fought against. Who did the United States fight in World War II? Japan, Germany, and Italy. Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general. What war was he in? This question wording is a little confusing. So first, we need to establish that in 1953, Dwight Eisenhower, who was known by the nickname Ike, was elected, well, he began serving as president. He had been elected in 1952, so he started serving as president from 1953, and he finished in 1961, so he served 2 terms. But before he was elected president, he became famous and popular in the United States because he was a successful general leading our troops in World War II. Before he was president, Eisenhower was a general. What war was he in? World War II. Our next question is about the Cold War that lasted from just after World War II up until 1990. During the Cold War, what was the main concern of the United States? I need to stop to explain for just a minute the difference between a communist economy and a market economy. In a communist economy, the government owns the businesses. In a market economy, individual people, groups of people, people who own stocks in the company, those are the people who own the businesses. Who makes decisions about products, prices, wages, etc.? In a communist economy, the government makes those decisions. In a market economy, companies and people make those decisions. Countries that have or had a communist economy, the Soviet Union had a communist economy, Cuba, China, there's a few other countries in the world that have communist economies. Examples of countries with market economies are the United States, England, or Great Britain, France, etc. So during that window from the end of World War II until around 1990, the Soviet Union had a communist government, and it was taking over a bunch of countries along its western border, and it was trying to influence a lot of other countries to encourage them to also become communist. Meanwhile, the United States was trying to encourage countries not to be communist and to have a market economy. During the Cold War, what was the main concern of the United States? Communism. What movement tried to end racial discrimination? First, we're going to define racial discrimination. It means not treating someone equally because of their race. So, for example, in many parts of the United States, there was a time where they would say white people can use certain bathrooms or certain water fountains, and they used the term colored to mean somebody who was black or African American. People had to use separate water fountains and separate bathrooms. People believed that having integration, having people of different races go to school together or get married or even be friends with each other. There was a group of people who thought that that was bad, that they didn't think that people from different races should interact with each other. They wanted to discriminate against people because of their race. Here's an example of a sign outside of a community where mostly or maybe all white people lived, and they said they did not want anyone who was not white to live in their community. And they actually put it on a sign, and they put American flags with it, thinking that it was patriotic of them to show that they only wanted white people to live near them. These are all examples of racial discrimination in our country's history. A movement, the question asks what movement tried to end racial discrimination. Normally when we say movement, we mean moving your body, right? A movement. I made a sudden movement with my hand. Movement can also mean actions by a lot of people trying to get the country to change. So these are all pictures from the movement that was trying to end racial discrimination during the 50s and 60s in our country. So here are a whole bunch of people marching, carrying signs. They want equal rights. They want freedom. They want integrated schools. They shouldn't have separate schools for black children and white children. They said we should have decent housing, no matter what race a person is, no matter what color their skin is. We demand an end to bias. That's another word for discrimination. Here's an example of a woman who was arrested because she refused to move to the black section of the bus. On a city bus, they said white people sit in this area and black people have to move to the back when more white people get on the bus. and she refused because she wanted to be part of the movement to end discrimination, and she was willing to be arrested in order to try to stop racial discrimination on the bus. Here's an example of a group of white and black students who rode on buses together specifically to try to force each state to allow the integration of buses. And here's a young woman going into a school that had previously been only for white students, and she's going to be the first black student allowed to attend that school when the national government and the Supreme Court said that schools can no longer have separate schools for white students and black students. All of these were actions that were part of the movement trying to end racial discrimination. That movement was called the Civil Rights Movement. One of the most famous examples of an action in the Civil Rights Movement was the March on Washington in 1963. Civil rights is another way of saying equal rights, a movement so that everyone will have equal rights. And you'll notice some of these signs from 1963 include demanding voting rights for all people, no matter what their race is, and an end to police brutality. So police brutality against African American citizens has been a problem in our country for many, many, many decades. And back in 1963, part of the civil rights movement was trying to end police brutality. This March on Washington, you can see all of this is people filling up a huge area in Washington, D.C. They've marched through the city, and then they've arrived to watch a series of speeches. What movement tried to end racial discrimination? The Civil Rights Movement. Two of the most famous speakers from the March on Washington were Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis is this gentleman here in the middle. John Lewis was the chairperson of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that led a lot of student actions during the Civil Rights Movement. He went on to become a congressman for many years, and he died this summer at the age of 80 years old, having served our country for many, many, many years, including back when he gave a speech at the March on Washington. He was the youngest speaker at the time. The most famous speaker at the time was Martin Luther King Jr. What did Martin Luther King Jr. do? He worked for civil rights. Like many people in the movement, he was willing to be arrested in order to make a point about the unjust laws and discrimination in the laws. He gave tons and tons of speeches. He encouraged many Americans to try to end racial discrimination. What did Martin Luther King Jr. do? He worked for civil rights. What major event happened on September 11th, 2001 in the United States? Terrorists attacked the United States. This is a picture of the Twin Towers buildings that two airplanes flew into. Airplanes also tried to attack places in Washington, D.C. One of them successfully attacked the Pentagon, which is our largest building for the United States military. What major event happened on September 11th, 2001 in the United States? Terrorists attacked the United States. Here are all of the questions that we did today. If you are following along in the book that we use in Literacy Volunteers, these questions are from Chapter 6. You can pause here to practice all of the questions. See our citizenship playlist for more citizenship videos. Thanks so much.